Let's take a look at how we can interact with Azure Storage Tables through our code.
I'm actually going to use this demonstration to show you a few different things and then probably reuse it again as a starting point for another demonstration, but that's not the point. The point is there's actually a lot that we can kind of take in a fairly simple example looking at what we can do with Azure Table Storage. The pattern that we're going to use for table storage is similar to the pattern that we would use to code against queue storage or blob storage as well. File storage is a little bit different. All right, let's start out by looking at a project. I've got a project, it's just a console application I've created. Haven't really done anything with it except I've added some NuGet packages. And I just want to show you the packages. I've added the Microsoft.data.services.client package. And if we look at Azure, all right, now I actually added two of these and one of them was added automatically. The Key Vault core was added automatically. I've added the Configuration Manager and the Windows Azure Storage. Now the Configuration Manager is going to allow me to use my configuration files in a way that they can be overridden easily when I deploy to Azure, such as in a web application. And I'll show you why that's so important and can be so useful. All right, now the first thing that I've done is I've actually set up a connection string, and this is why I pulled in that configuration management, because this connection string is storage location. Right now it's set to use the development storage. Okay, and that's going to be great because I'm in development. Obviously, I've got my storage emulator set up. I'm going to show you a little bit about that as well, just very briefly. Okay, now the advantage of this is when I deploy this, then in, let's say, a web application, I could go in through the web application settings and replace this with an actual connection string to my real storage, to my actual Azure storage. But this is great for now, and that's all I want to do. All right, so now let's talk about actually using Azure Storage. Well, I've added 3 namespaces to give me some of the things that I want, and I'm going to need all 3 of those. But before I do any actual coding here, what I want to do is I want to create an object that I'm going to manage as part of my table. And the cool thing is that I can really do this pretty much on the fly as far as Azure Storage is concerned. Okay, I'm going to just create a simple demonstration that involves managing employees. So I'm going to create a public class employee, and I'm going to inherit from a class table entity. That's really the only real requirement for me to be able to use this with Azure Table Storage. Now, when I inherit from table entity, it's going to pick up 2 properties. It's going to be the row key and the partition key, and then I can add whatever else I want. So let's say, just for the sake of argument, that I add in an integer, which is years at company. Okay, and I'm also going to add in an override of the toString method as though I typed amazingly fast. Okay, so that's just putting out the data in a formatted way if I want to write out the employee data, but that's not really critical. What is critical is that I've got table entity. It's going to give me those key properties that I have, row key and partition key, and then also I can add whatever else I want, which is in this case years at company, and that's trivial. But it sets up the object that I need to use. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to connect up to a client, and I'm going to put 3 lines of code in here as though I type amazingly fast. There we go. All right, and I want to take a look at all of these. First of all, I retrieve the connection string. Now I use the Cloud Configuration Manager. You may be familiar with system.configuration.configuration manager. This is similar, except it's going to interact with Azure and pull it out of a config file if it's available, or pull it out of Azure if I've sent something there. Now in this case, it's just a console application, but it's going to work fine with my app config file. And so I get the setting storage connection, which if we look over here, there's my storage connection. Okay, so I've got that setting. Then I use that to connect to my actual cloud storage account. And I use the parse method, which is a static method of cloud storage account, passing it the connection string. That's going to give me my account. I then use the account to create a client, and that's going to be the pattern you'll see again and again. Okay, now the next thing I want to do is I want to get the table itself. And there's really 2 lines of code, and again, this is a pattern you'll see pretty common. I pull back a reference to a table. We're going to get the table roster, and I use the create if not exists. So if it exists, great. If it doesn't exist, this will create it. Now the next step is to actually create the objects that I'm going to work with. I'm going to create 3 instances of employees. And that is really nothing to do with Azure other than the fact that the employee has a partition key and a row key because, again, they inherit from table entity. So now I've got some entities that I can interact with my table, and so now I want to start adding them in. First, I'm going to add in an individual employee. All right, and I'm going to do that by 2 things that are very Azure. First, I create a table operation. And this operation is going to be insert or replace. And if I look at it, there's a number of different operations that you can work with. I'm going to just go with insert or replace, and then I execute that operation. So it's a single operation. But if you're doing a massive scale insert or other kind of modification, you do have the ability to work with a batch process. And I'm going to show you that by adding in the next 2. Okay, so here, instead of a table operation, I use a table batch operation. And I use insert or replace with 2 different objects. And then I use the execute batch instead of the execute. Now, one thing with the batch that I always forget is that if you are working with a batch, it's going to work against a specific partition. So everything in the batch has to have the same partition key, which is the case with the second and third. Okay, so now I've got some data. Now I want to get the data back. And there's a couple different ways I can do that. One is via a query. And again, I'm going to type that amazingly fast or possibly paste it in. All right, and so what I do with the query is say, okay, I want to find all the people that are in IT. What I do is I use a table query, which is coming from the Microsoft.WindowsAzure.storage.table. And the table query is a generic, so I specify that I want to use this for the type employee. And then this is kind of cool. It has a where method. And then I have this generate filter condition, which is actually just going to generate a string. And you could build your own string, and you can just look at what this does. But it's going to define partition key equals IT. Okay? And then I take that, and I loop through the employees. Okay, and I do that by using table.executeQuery, and again, that's going to be a generic, so I specify it's going to return employee, and it's going to use that query that I just created and loop through them. So that's one way to retrieve data from a table, is to use a query. I can also retrieve data directly from an instance by using the retrieve method, and we'll take a look at that. There's the retrieve method. So in this case, I'm being very explicit. I'm getting Janice, who is the 3rd employee here. All right, and I'm going to use a retrieve operation, table operation dot retrieve. So this is not a query. This is a different table operation. I'm going to retrieve data of type employee, and the key, the partition key is sales. Oh, it says get Janice. That really should be get Bob because it was Janice and I changed it. And the actual row key is Bob. We'll have to change that. And okay, so there we go. And then that really should be Bob. Not that that's really important, but it's bothering me, so it's probably bothering you too. Okay, I realize it's a little bit long, but we're just about there. Now, before we go and run this, all right, this is going to run against the local storage emulator. All right, well, in order to run the local storage emulator, you actually have to run the local storage emulator. And it's actually pretty easy to run. I can just type Azure Storage, and notice it comes up with the Microsoft Azure Storage Emulator, in this case, version 4.5. Well, I'm already running that. I'm going to show it to you. Now, I've got a command line that is running against this, and it's pretty cool. You can open this command line. Once you run that, you can open this up from your taskbar, and if we look at this, I'm just all over the place there. Okay, I've been doing many things here. Azure Storage Emulator, you run that. You can init the Azure Storage Emulator. You have to do that one time. You can start and stop it, you can view the status, and you can clear it. Well, frankly, I've been testing quite a bit and I didn't clear this out. So I'm going to, for example, clear my table storage so I can run this again. Okay, so we've got that, and my storage emulator is running, and this is almost going to be anticlimactic, okay? But I'm going to start without debugging, and it's going to come up on the other screen, and I'll drag it up. Okay, so there you go. Not super exciting, but you can see it did return my 3 users, Janice and Sue first. They were the IT users that were filtered, that were queried, and then Bob was the individual user that I returned. And I could have done a little bit of job of formatting that, but that's not really the key. All right, so what are the key takeaways from this? And then we'll take off. First of all, this is the pattern that you want to use when you're interacting with your Azure storage in any way. Get the account, first of all, use a connection string, my strong recommendation. Pull that connection string out of your settings using cloud configuration. Use that with the cloud storage account parse. Then open up the type of client you want, then start working with it. Second stage is working with the table itself. The create if not exist, you'll see that frequently. Adding different elements to the table, whether it's by a single operation or a batch operation. Key is that element has to inherit from table entity. Now, I could have, by the way, added completely different entities. I could have a couple of employees, I could have a couple customers, put them all into the same table, because Azure doesn't really care. It just cares about that really, the basic key structure, which is the partition key and the row key, because everything else is going to be stored really as a dictionary of data in the table itself. So a number of things that we covered here, and you'll do a lot of these things in your lab work, but the lab sort of breaks it up a little bit, which is great from the standpoint of good practice. I wanted to show you the flow from the very beginning to the very end, all in one place.
As you can see, it's a relatively simple pattern. There are definitely a few steps in there, but think about being able to use this pattern, pretty much the same pattern, across just an array of possible data storage, NoSQL data storage requirements.